What lessons have you got from the first startup? Like, why did it fail? Why didn't it work out?
Oh, I mean, so many. It colored a lot of my life, but one is understand for thinking about products.
How do you think about building businesses generally?
I think about this pretty fundamentally when I think about building a marketplace in construction. This is actually starting to become a bit of a thesis of mine, which is you need people who understand.
Was there any disappointment and rejection when you were fundraising, or was it quite?
Or you had it all figured out?
Yeah.
Well, those are two different things. There was a lot of rejection. I wasn't disappointed to get it.
Yeah.
Back in the day when we were just a team of 3 at Uber, we would put on suits and go down to the airport and speak to drivers and say, hey, we've built this thing that we think could really help you earn more revenue. And most drivers would basically just...
Hey everyone, and welcome to Groundbreakers, where we reveal the stories behind the most successful founders and operators in AEC technology, from exits in the multiple hundreds of millions through to the struggles of building in a resilient industry. We've got you covered. Before we get started though, if you're a startup founder or operator responsible for innovation in your company, or you want a deeper, more insightful look into technology in AEC, you won't want to miss our newsletter. From deep dives into particular technologies such as AI, robotics, design, software, and so on. Hot takes from investors betting big in AEC technology and advice on building tech companies, including the stories and takeaways of the most successful AEC technology founders. Head over to www.bricks-bytes.com and sign up today to get this exclusive material straight to your inbox. And now for the episode.
All right, Oscar. Well, thanks for coming to London today, all the way from Australia.
Great to be here, guys.
Via Copenhagen?
Yeah, that's right. Via Latvia.
Via Latvia?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. What were you doing in Latvia?
I was seeing a guy about a kitchen. We've got a...
Is that is the word in
euphemism?
Euphemism?
No. That's my job now. It sounds like euphemism, but I just see people about kitchens. We were meeting one of our suppliers in our network, and we were reviewing some work for a sample for a project that's going to go forward somewhere else in Europe in the next couple months. So that's a lot of my job still, is doing the unscalable things that will scale this marketplace.
Yeah, Paul Graham classic, that one.
Did it go well?
Great kitchen. Yeah. Everything looked great, actually. So I was really impressed.
How big is the order?
It is a couple $100,000 for a hotel.
Okay. And how many pieces is it?
It'll be, maybe 40 different individual designs over just over 100 rooms.
Okay. That's done by Cutr.
So the pricing of that is automated. So you can imagine, design package and brief uploaded onto the Cutr platform. Our software will read the files, extract the geometry, apply that to what we know about pricing, create a bottoms-up price, and then there's also sort of a market-led price input as well, and then we use that to determine what we can do the job for. We essentially run a reverse auction with all of the people on our network. We have a tagging system for making sure that the best manufacturer with the potentially the most availability and the most capacity to do a job are the ones who get to see these sorts of jobs. And then there's a project management toolkit over the top that makes sure the jobs go well. There's project financing underneath the bottom, so customers can pay when they want, manufacturers get paid when they want, and nobody has to put up bank guarantees or any of that sort of stuff that really slows down projects.
So sounds like a good platform.
There we go. Thank you, guys.
Yeah.
Tune into the next episode.
What is reverse auction?
So you can imagine an auction is saying, hey, here's a thing, what's the price, right? And another way of doing that is
going to bid more, right?
Here's the price. Who can do it for that price?
Oh, I do it all the time.
Yeah.
Hustling, it sounds like. Okay, before we get into the detail, you gave us a few things there which you'll definitely unpack throughout the episode. your entrepreneurial career, obviously you're from Australia. You lived there for however many years. I know you had some involvement with Uber, and particularly launching some things over there. So yeah, could you just give us a little bit of the lay of the land of Oscar?
Sure. So I am broadly come out of the finance industry, but really didn't last long. That's what I studied. I worked for a year. My job was basically selling financial instruments to pensioners in the middle of the GFC hitting, and it just felt like such a grim way to spend a career. And I really didn't like the fact that my job was to sort of make money at the expense of helping people. I think I also probably had like an accountability problem. Like I maybe didn't think I was smart enough to be there, and was running from that. And so I thought, well, best way to avoid that accountability is to go start my own business. And I turned out to be like absolutely wrong, because entrepreneurialism exposes every weakness that you have, and it's a total humbling kind of grinding into building a character. And we started a business with a couple of friends when we were younger. It was a sustainability business. Basically, our pitch was environmentalism. The story is everybody's either a climate change denier or a hippie. And that actually hides what's most important about the environmental movement, which is moving to a more complete understanding of the stuff that we do that impacts our environment and how we use that to run society. And there's actually like trillions of dollars to be made in that. There's new infrastructure to be built. There's new technologies to be discovered. So it's a real sci-fi level of, world building that's happening in moving to a sustainable set of industries and planet.
What was the product?
And we wanted to cover those stories. So we wanted to cover the stories from science and tech. So we kind of made like a little bit of a Vice TV. I don't know, those guys are now out of business, but like a vertical content website for sustainability issues. And we focused on science and tech. And so we were and business. And so we were covering a lot of stories of like, we covered the first solar flight around the world. We covered there's like a sort of NASA space setup run out of the University of Griffith that was tracking cow burps and trying to reduce methane emissions of cow burps. We covered the first energy marketplaces, the first competitors even before Elon Musk and Tesla happened. Before that, there was a company called Better Place, which was trying to redo the electric car grid. So we covered all these stories, and there's one theme for me kept coming up, which was marketplaces are basically a sustainability business model, because you can't have a marketplace unless so many more people are using so much less of a thing that you can justify taking a margin in between for enabling that service. So to have a marketplace, you have to be using resources way more efficiently than anyone off the marketplace, right? And so that's what I got really excited about. We had to wind up that business after we made a television show, sold it into the GFC, didn't make our money back, had to wind it up. I was pretty broke. I was looking for my next thing. And a couple of marketplaces out of San Francisco came along, and I got very excited about Uber. So I emailed them, basically said I'm willing to do, whatever. Met a guy in a burger store in Bondi who turned out to be my first boss. We hit it off. He was one of the smartest guys I ever met. And I just felt like I can really learn a lot here about maybe the next steps in my career. And so said yes. And then Uber kept getting bigger and bigger. And so I kept saying yes to more and more crazy jobs at Uber. And then ended up staying there from, I think, about 100 employees to maybe about 40,000 when I left.
Wow.
And
that was just the entire company, 100 to 40,000?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, not just like one region.
Yeah.
100 to 40,000. Wow.
Yeah. I think it came down from 40 after I left. I left just after the IPO.
That's grand. What lessons have you got from the first startup? Like, why did it fail? Why didn't it work out? Oh,
I mean, so many. It colored a lot of my life. But one is understand distribution before thinking about products. So like, think about who's going to buy this and what and how you're going to get it in front of those people before you think about what you're actually trying to solve. Because often in the process of doing that, it also forces you to just speak to customers, and then customers force you to actually build something different from what you expected. We built something we wanted to build. We started with this like big top-down mission, and it just turned out people wanted something different. And then I think the second one is like, just kind of be willing to be wrong early. Like being wrong early is always cheaper than being wrong late. And I think I was just avoiding having tough conversations because I was worried that if I was wrong about this, then am I wrong about the business? And if I'm wrong about the business, then who am I? And that's just actually not useful. Like now I kind of think of my job as I'm paid to de-risk an assumption. And there's plenty of ways to do that. But the longer I sit on one strongly held belief, the less I can try others.
Run towards the punch in the face. I love that saying.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. That's very much how we describe our day to day.
Yeah, I love it. So Uber, how was obviously it's such a large brand name to have on your CV, and assuming you learned quite a lot. So what was your role like primarily there? And again, maybe some lessons learned that you're...
So I was there for 8 years. I didn't really have a primary role. I did a lot of different things. When I started, I was kind of setting up our customer support, marketing, sales motion for Sydney only. And when I left, I was actually had 2 jobs. One was running sort of a big chunk of our restaurant division for Uber Eats. And then in between there, I tried my hand at general management, at running expansion markets. I worked on self-driving cars for a bit. I was for kind of a hot few months. I was the lead for operations at our self-driving car division, which was a crazy time. So I kind of basically I determined that I had been given an opportunity that most people didn't get. And I was just going to say yes to all the hardest, craziest stuff that all the other people in the business were saying no to because they didn't want to do it. So I basically set myself up as the bag man. And then that made me go to a lot of places and meet a lot of people. And actually the most fun in my career and the coolest people I ever met are the people that I worked with during that time.
Yeah. What was it like working for a company like that? So like in your peak, you left that when there was 40,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
So starting with 100, you're probably in contact with like nearly, I don't know how, like a large portion of that, the people you're dealing with. But when you get to like 40,000, you can only really speak to maximum of maybe 50 of those. Like, at what point does it just become like, almost feel like completely messy or still very structured when you have like a company like Uber doing it?
Well, it always feels messy. It only gets worse. Right, like the best way of describing a company is if you're growing, it's chaos, and the faster you grow, the more chaotic it is. And so, when we were 100 employees, I was the only person doing 5 different jobs, right? And our tech didn't work for generating invoices, so I would have to copy paste a screenshot of an invoice and slap it on a Word document and send it to a customer every time they asked. And when customers were asking 10 times a week, that was fine. When they were asking 1,000 times a week, that was a problem. And you never build the tech before you really need it because you're always growing so fast. So if the problem's not burning, then it's not a problem. And that was also a lot of the ops ethos that Travis and Ryan Graves tried to like really hammer into the business. Is ops' job is the pointy end of the stick. So we handle all the stuff that hasn't been handled by technology, and our job is to kind of make ourselves redundant. When it got really large, frankly, I was tested on building a sort of collaboration, coordination, and political skill set, right? Which was really, really valuable to understand how to build. How do you think about driving organizations of like hundreds of people? How do you get that to coordinate with another organization of hundreds of people? How do you do that across like 6 different language groups, right? What should be standardized and what should be specialized? And those were really interesting problems. Ultimately, it was during a really weird time as well. We were IPOing. We just changed CEOs. And I think they were simultaneously trying to trade out the old guard of Uber, but also needed them because they were kind of glue for a lot of the stuff that still needed to run. And so I think I actually burnt myself out just kind of trying to fix something that was inherently bigger and more out of control. And I just at some point went, that's not my job anymore. And I'm probably not even the best person to do it. So that's when I knew it was time to leave and take a break.
What was next?
Next was Oscar having year of Oscar. I was going to travel. I was going to get, I was going to get fit again. I was going to drop 5 kilos. And I went down to Ishgol for a ski weekend
Where's your school?
Ischgel's in Austria.
Okay.
And that weekend was the exact weekend that COVID broke out of Italy and went through Ischgl to like 50% of Europe. So I was like a patient one for
Oh wow.
for
Super spreader all over the news.
and I was so burnt out. I was so burnt out that I got sick for a long time. And then it was into lockdowns and everything. So actually, they say when you quit before you do your next thing, you should really get bored. And I had an entire year of being in lockdown to get really, really bored. And so at the end of that year, that's when I started seriously thinking about Cutr.
There's someone else you spoke to recently who sold their business like during or just before COVID. And we were like, hey, did you not go and enjoy some beach time? He was like, no, I was so bored. I just started another company. All right.
I think that's horses for courses, right? Like different people have different approaches, but I think that's an easy way to end up starting the wrong company. And you don't have to do something you're passionate about, but I actually think if you jump into the next thing
Too quickly.
you don't absorb enough, right?
You need to let it settle, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And come back to it and try other things and know what you don't want to do. So between me and starting Cutr, I think worked on at least 10 different businesses, whether it was directly advising or working as sort of fractional or even just trying to start it myself and doing the customer research and realizing that's not a thing.
What was the profile of these businesses? Like marketplaces or not necessarily?
No, different types of things. Some of them were marketplaces.
What was where were you gravitating towards?
Well, first of all, I just wanted to get involved in other businesses and see how they run. So I just kind of said yes to a couple of things where I thought the team was good. So one was a sleepwear business. So think D2C. One was a business that's now called Me and You, which was SaaS for restaurants. And then a number of other types of businesses in between. What I increasingly knew was I was obsessed about marketplaces. I was pretty convinced that marketplaces in B2B aren't going to look like marketplaces in B2C for a number of reasons. So there's like new stuff that needs to get built there. And I was really looking for kind of three things. One was really, really big industry with a bad pricing problem, because I basically think of marketplaces as a pricing product ultimately. You can't, the price at which supply and demand meet is basically the product of a marketplace. So step one, really big industry with a really bad pricing problem. Step two, marketplace can be a solution for that pricing problem. If the right conditions exist, like there's high fragmentation, lots of small players trying to do things. Transactions are expensive because you need to shake hands and have coffee or whatever else it is. And then three, if you can fix that pricing problem and have some big efficiencies as a result of marketplace, you can have a really big impact on carbon emission reduction. So I knew that I wanted to get back into focusing on the sustainability problem from a business perspective and seeing if I could have a really kind of big impact by building a big company. And so I looked at a number of different businesses. I was thinking of seaweed farming in the North Sea. I was thinking of growing bamboo. That's kind of how I started getting involved in like forestry and wood. I was looking at, this commodity model for getting wood to where it needs to go. And at the same time, I was renovating my house and having a really terrible time of it. And that's when I started to think a little bit more about, hey, maybe there's something to build at this end. And at the same time, I was chatting to my friend who's now my co-founder, Rodney, and he was saying, well, I'm trying to automate pricing in my business, and I think I've got an approach for how to do it. And he owned a manufacturing facility. So went over, had a couple meetings, spent more time with him and the rest of the team that were working on it. We picked up one more co-founder in the process who was also working with Rodney on it. And we essentially built the first version of can we automate pricing for a manufacturer, interior manufacturer and construction manufacturer. And then from there, started to plug it in with more. And then we kind of just naturally fell into it, and it always felt good. So I always kept doing more. And that's when I kind of knew that this was the thing I was going to work on.
Okay. This pricing problem issue is super interesting. So the pricing problem, you mean there is various prices for the same or similar type of good or product, and there is like imbalance or difficult to establish what's the price for what exactly? Or
yeah, so
how do you define the pricing problem?
So by the time you're dealing with an SKU, the pricing problem is solved. What I mean by SKU is like a product, right? So if you're buying an IKEA cabinet, that's not a pricing problem. You know what the IKEA cabinet it costs, right? But most construction and certainly a huge chunk of interiors, right, is not freestanding. It's custom. There's services over the top of it, right? And that starts to get really, really complicated when you think about pricing. And it's a bit of a living beast because it interacts with other things, right? So if one contractor's late and it affects someone else's rollout, then that can also affect pricing, right? Mm-hmm. And so I probably interviewed 60 to 70 interior builders and constructors during, and by that I mean prefabricated constructors. So people who make things in a factory, they get asked by someone else, whether that's a general contractor, and they need to make that thing, and they need to figure out how much that costs. And every single one of them basically said, I have two problems that are the biggest ones, which is capacity management.
Hey listeners, I want to take a quick break to remind you about the Bricks Bytes newsletter. If you're interested in learning about the technology shaping the future of construction, you won't want to miss the valuable insights we share each week. To get this exclusive content delivered straight to your inbox, head over to www.bricks-bytes.com and sign up today. Link is in the show notes. Back to the show.
And making sure I do things for the right price. And doing things for the right price takes me a lot of time to figure out because I have to plug it all into a spreadsheet. It's different every time. There's always exceptions. And every single one of them that we spoke to that went out of business said, I went out of business for two reasons. Either I didn't manage my cash flow or I misquoted and had to stick to the price. And then they tried to make it up a little bit more in the next job and the next job and the next job. So we felt like that was a really interesting place to start, is how do you price custom jobs automatically in a way that you're fairly likely to be accurate?
Mm-hmm.
Good.
So could you just, for the layman's that might be listening, could you just explain what Cutr does?
Yeah. So we sort of started off as we're a manufacturing marketplace for custom joinery. And today, an interior designer, an architect, a general contractor, even other interior builders who don't have capacity in their machines can upload their design files onto our platform, or their brief, or their PDF, or their photo, and we will price the job. We will find the right manufacturer for the job, and we will have the job be managed over our platform using a bunch of project management tooling that makes it easier for those jobs to get done. And we started off doing parts orders. So you can think, cabinetry parts, flat packs, that sort of thing. And as we've grown, we've started to do more and more complicated processes and products. So, today we'll make residential fit outs, some of them low end, some of them luxury. We'll do hotels. The most complicated construction job we've actually handled on the platform is tiny spaces. So think, tiny homes and kind of caravan kind of constructions, that sort of thing. That's about where we draw the line, because what we don't really want to touch yet is zoning and permissioning. We think that's a whole separate piece of software to build out, and we don't really want to approach that until we're ready.
Yeah, fine. So the people that would use your platform, on the buyer side, it would be general contractors, interior designers, perhaps developers who have like a plot that they need to redevelop.
Yep.
And on the supply side, you have the people that actually manufacture joinery, kitchens,
that's right,
cabinetry. Is it just timber that you deal with?
We specialize in wood and wood-based products, yes.
Why?
There's a couple reasons for that. The first and most probably the biggest upside piece here is wood on the surface looks like a supply chain that is very big and organized. It's about the size of concrete and steel combined. But it's the only construction material that's grown, not produced. And that actually creates a lot of really interesting dynamics. So in steel, or say aluminium, if you buy aluminium 71B, anatomically it's very similar to what you'd get in China or get it in India. You can ship it all around the world. You go to the cheapest cost of labor place and you get the biggest ratio, savings, right? So you can get a 3x saving from purchasing your product in China versus somewhere else. Well, none of that works in wood because wood grows everywhere. People have different tastes for the types of wood. Its travel value is very low. It's quite voluminous. So if you put it all into a shipping container, it's not nearly as valuable as an equivalent product in, say, steel. If you send it through the Suez Canal on a hot day, on your boat, it can warp. So there's all sorts of reasons why wood is grown and consumed fairly locally. And that actually means that there's a really big business to build as a marketplace because you've got lots of small businesses that are attached to these pretty fragmented supply chains that are trying to do work locally, but they're actually competitive regionally. And so if you can give a manufacturing facility in Latvia exposure to customers in Germany, they're more than able to fulfill those jobs. So there's a big discovery problem to solve. There's a big pricing problem to solve because every single one of these small manufacturers, they're quoting on wood supply chains that's coming in on a per batch level, and depending on the relationship they have with their supplier, it's either more expensive or less expensive. So there's no purchase power because everyone's a small business. And so putting everyone together into a buying group and giving them the option to be able to do their jobs for cheaper is a really big product. Same again with machine capacity because they're a small business. Their machines might be running 40% of the time, right? And if you can get that number up to 70%, they're a completely different business.
Yeah.
So there's lots of opportunities when you think of like really fragmented supply chain, small operators trying to do business with people, and they don't necessarily have the tools to do this sort of stuff. And then you overlay the fact that in steel, and actually pretty broadly in concrete as well, for the last 300 years, if you wanted to work with these what's called isotopic materials, you basically went to university for engineering, right? And so in that supply chain, you've got engineers talking to engineers about how to engineer a solution. And so, if you're building something in automotive, you're not asking the manufacturer what they think. You're telling them exactly what needs to get produced. Whereas in wood, you've got an interior designer talking to a carpenter, and they're loosely working on the same software and hardware, but the interior designer isn't drawing holes in their design. They're just saying you should know where the holes go. Likewise, the carpenter has learnt on the job where the holes should go, but it's not necessarily best practice. It's just the way they learnt. So there's a lot of this gray area that starts to roll into the design for manufacturing loop that's unique to the wood industry. So long-winded answer of saying this is a very, very big manufacturing supply chain with a lot of problems that are solved in other industries, but are unsolved in wood because of the uniqueness of it. And to the extent that we can take some of those innovations and get them into this industry, we think we can make it a lot more competitive. And actually, I ultimately think of our biggest competitor as being steel and concrete. The more we can encourage this supply chain to work just like contract manufacturing works in, say, steel today, the more we can get it to a place where wood becomes the obvious building material for a number of different use cases.
Very good. Sounds like you thought about it a lot.
I had a whole year under lockdown.
Why did you not go after margins of contractors, subcontractors, and go to B2C as well?
Well, it's a good question. I think some of this might be personal preference. So generally, when you're working with businesses, what I love about working with businesses, which I didn't quite like working in a B2C business like Uber Rides, was when you're working on, say, Uber Rides, you have to guess what customers want by the feedback that they may choose to give you, by relative metrics like percentage of your customer base that churned over X period sort of thing. And so you're constantly guessing, what do people want? Whereas in B2B, people just tell you, right?
Yeah,
so
they know what they want.
They not only do they know what they want, you're working with them over a long period of time. And so relationships to me were like just something that I wanted out of my next job. And I like the fact that we're building long-term partnerships with businesses. I like the fact that, we have manufacturers on our platform that started off in a rented garage and now have their own facility with more machines as a result of Cutr work that we've been able to provide them. And they call us up every time the platform's down or there's a complaint or they have ideas for software. That's just an environment that I like to work in. And ultimately, I think it builds really powerful software. The risk, of course, is knowing what to build and what not to build. And of course, you can't have things go wrong. Like we're very, very thoughtful about quality because people don't go away in this industry, right? Like partnerships are really long term.
Yeah. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about where the business is right now. Like what's the market you're serving? How many people are in the business? Sorry.
Size of maybe the market as well.
Yeah. So again, the wood supply chain is massive, right? So if you add in like freestanding wooden furniture, that's maybe estimated to be like 475 billion globally. IKEA doesn't really own that much of it, right? They own maybe like 4 or 5%. So again, you talk
distribution, huh?
It's just so fragmented and so large. And so the problem is, where do you start? The way we kind of thought about it was, well, in the future, we would like this to be the kind of operating system that you could get modular housing made on. You could get maybe residential made on, right? And we sort of handle the supply chain, and it's much more interconnected. But you need to start somewhere. Well, when you're automating pricing, that doesn't really matter for an IKEA because or a company that does like high serialization work, because they kind of have figured out the price, or they've at least negotiated something. But when you're doing lots of custom work, even if it's quite serializable, that work always needs new pricing. And so then you always have someone sitting down, spending sometimes hundreds of hours just trying to get a spreadsheet looking right. So that felt like an area where our customers were saying, I really need help in this area. So we started off with sort of custom cabinetry. We don't do construction because, again, we don't want to touch the zoning, and we don't do really highly serializable mass market stuff. We focus on the custom construction interiors loop. That niche, that starting niche, because this business is so large, is still estimated to be about 60 billion in Europe alone. So it's still like a very, very big starting niche, right? And it makes sense when you think about some chunk of residential interiors are custom made. It's probably a pretty big chunk, right? Hotels are almost always custom made. Lots of products are custom made. On the back end, even if on the front end a customer is buying an individual product, that got made somewhere, and it's usually a contractor-manufacturer relationship. And there's very few companies in this industry that are really vertically integrated. Almost everyone works on contract basis. And so anywhere where that custom pricing product is required, that's a really good place for us to start. So that's kind of where we're at. You know, have we even begun to penetrate it? No. We've been growing quite fast. We sort of hope to 3x this year. We 10x'd in our first year, and we 3.5x last year. We've been at it for coming up on 3 years now, so growing quite fast. But most of our business by jobs still in sort of Northern Europe. We've started to take on customers in the UK. And Germany and France in probably the last 9 months.
So are you after right now penetrating market deeper, or are you looking at other markets and other geographies?
I don't think geographies are a really big focus right now. Well, maybe let me answer this question this way. Marketplaces have different local maxima, right? So a great example, Uber taxis, your local maxima is really suburb level, right? So you're trying to match within a local suburb, right? You go to, say, a food delivery business or a grocery delivery marketplace, you start to think maybe within a 5-kilometer radius is your local maxima. We think the local maxima for this business is bigger than most people think it is. So it's actually sub-regional to regional. And so historically, you've had small local businesses doing very, very local kind of transactions, right? I know the manufacturer around the road. But as you get bigger and you can standardize some ways of working, especially, you know, even just talk the same language, the choices for you to be able to go further afield to get the best option increase. And so it's not that we're consciously targeting other markets, is that other markets are contacting us and starting to say, hey, can you service our market as well? So we've actually been quite passive in targeting other countries in Europe, but other countries have started reaching out to us and saying, and some of our customers who operate in multiple countries are starting to pull us as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's a very broad question, but how do you think about building businesses generally? Because one thing I would say is obviously, we'll get into this, like you are VC backed and there's there's demand for perhaps fast growth from that side, but in a similar sentence, perhaps in the construction industry, fast growth is not necessarily a good thing and can lead to a lot of issues. So, any thoughts on that?
10x, 3x. That sounds like a
Yeah, what's the right multiple to grow every year? You'd be happy. This is a really good question. My sister, I work with my sister. She's an architect. She's got a master's in robotics fabrication. So she's very handy. I was getting so much free advice from her. At some point I said, you should just come work with me. She turned to me once when, we had we were working through an issue, and she said, I'm a measure twice, cut once kind of gal. And you're like a measure never, cut all the time kind of person. And I think about this pretty fundamentally when I think about building a marketplace in construction. This is actually starting to become a bit of a thesis of mine, which is you need people who understand networks. So there's a particular type of skill set in marketplaces, which is understanding how networks work, what metrics to look for, what data to collect, and importantly, what to ignore. And there's very few people in the construction industry that have that skill set, right? But there's very few people who have that skill set that have a construction skill set. And so the secret sauce is pairing those two people together and figuring out, how do you measure twice, cut once, but also see way more transactions than any single business could see. So the power of a marketplace is really you see so much that you know what to optimize that single businesses would never know that that's a thing that they are able to optimize, or they'd never be able to get it. Simplest one is like, hey, once you're big enough, you can get purchase power for individuals as if you're a big company, but you're not. You're a collection of small companies, all pulling together. And so that's actually, I would say, the flip of this, right? There's lots of downside risks to growing fast, but the opportunity of growing fast is that you can start telling the industry more things about what you're seeing than the industry has ever put together themselves. And I think about this a lot when I think about, well, how much of the innovation and the work that we need to do is going to happen in the factory versus at the network level. And I think if you're solving really novel problems, like you're a Tesla or you're an Endural or you're a Cutr even, right? The belief that those companies hold is that 80% of the work to be done needs to happen in the factory. Like that's where the optimization happens. But actually, if you're building a marketplace, 80% of the opportunity happens at the network level. And so the bigger the network, the faster you can improve. So there is this tension, right, in building a marketplace in construction. And I think part of this might also be the reason why it's really hard to build a marketplace in construction. This is also the reason why we're not taking the Cutr route, even though in the future, would I like to build products like Cutr built on our platform? Yes. If I did that today and we got one thing wrong, we'd be out of business. And so luckily, no one dies when you miss a piece of a cabinet, right? And so it's a safer place with faster transactions for us to learn and iterate faster and build software that works before we start scaling it and taking on more problems.
Speaking of growth, what's your attitude towards revenue?
Attitude?
Well, how do you think? Sorry,
love them. Can't get enough
revenues.
Yeah.
Well, how do you think about the
We're just here for fun.
Revenue growing? Because people can keep scaling, but there's no substance on the back of that, and there's no potential for revenue from this scale.
Yeah, so we've raised VC money because I believe it's just going to be expensive to build this business. And if you're trying to build the network, you need to invest to a certain degree to get the network to a large enough, what you call a statistically significant data set for the types of problems you're trying to solve, right? We need to see enough orders to know what software we should build to then automate those things that are going sideways in the orders. But there's actually, I think, pretty simple and foolproof answer to this question, which is don't sell $2 for one. So in a marketplace, typically you're looking at unit economics, right? So I think it's okay to subsidize your fixed costs, but you probably always want to be clearing a gross profit. And I think a lot of marketplaces get this wrong early. They think the network is way more important than the unit economic profitability of their transactions. And so they sell stuff and they subsidize all the time and they run a negative margin. And then what ends up happening is the bigger you grow, the more you lose. And grow themselves into a situation they can't get out of. And then one thing needs to change, just one little thing in the market, like interest rates going from 0 to 5%
Collapse.
globally, right? Yeah, like a recession. And then suddenly you can't raise what you thought you would. And so we actually talk internally a lot of the time about being cockroaches, right? Like our job is to build long enough to survive, right? Like I take a lot of the Procore story at heart, right? It takes a very long time to build something that's generational. And it's always going to be longer and harder than we expect. And so I'm totally fine to take risks and subsidize where we need to, but I always want to make sure we're striving for that kind of unit economic profitability to make sure that we're doing something sensible and we know that it has like long-term value that's sustainable. Does that answer your question?
Yes. What's like a monthly volume of sales in terms of like numbers of or kitchens or products month by month?
Yeah. One of the things that we struggle with, honestly, is averages, because we're seeing a lot of different types of things, right? From a few different types of customers. So we really focus on sort of one core customer, which is interior builders. And interior builders, typically they have factories, right? Maybe those factories are completely full and they need to outsource a lot of their work. Maybe their factory doesn't have the right machines and they need to outsource. But we're starting off with just building this outsourcing network. And the cool thing about that kind of customer is if you look after them on the $5,000 job, they come back with the $10,000 job. And if you look after them on the $10,000 job, they come back with the $500,000 job. So very quickly it jumps into like really big numbers. The risk there, of course, is that the $500,000 job might be a tender, right? And so now it's like a different process and it looks slightly different to the $5,000 job, which they just needed to send out themselves. So, average month at the moment, we're doing sort of kind of 50 new projects a month. They can range quite variably in terms of average revenue of, per job.
Yeah.
We have a number of the smaller jobs really automated at this point, actually. So if you go on and you have a file that works and you know what material you want to build the thing out of, you can get an instant price on our platform, no matter how custom the work is.
You don't even have to wait these 12 hours.
No. You get that price in, I think, the time it takes to run the optimization software. So it's less than a minute, really. Wow. We automate actually a lot of the medium to large jobs as well, but we have our quoting team in the loop checking a lot of the outputs because there's always extra stuff and edge cases. And then we, again, collect that data and use it to build better pricing software as well. So over time, the goal is to kind of automate more and more. But we think about it in terms of sort of number of jobs, and then we think about it in terms of average order value. And that average order value has been sort of doubling roughly every 6 months for the last kind of 24 months because customers are just starting to trust us with bigger and bigger orders.
Do you see any challenges for $100 orders from January 2025 on average? Like what sort of challenges are you foreseeing having these numbers of orders growing?
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly what you just asked me on about, what is the downside risk of growing too fast, right? So you need to see enough to know how to automate some stuff. Really, really simple example, right? Manufacturers need to confirm that an order is leaving the warehouse, right? Today, that's a series of photos, project management software, but when we started, it was like, has the order left the warehouse over a WhatsApp call, right? And before that product gets built, you can't even track how many times it's going wrong. So again, you jump on WhatsApp. So the project management overhead doesn't just like increase proportionally, it increases disproportionately. So you have to balance how efficient you are with how fast you can grow. An example of this is in Q2, we started seeing some tender type orders that we hadn't really seen before, and our quoting team just completely broke, right? Because they were just way too busy. But then we rolled out some product within 3 months, and now they can quote those orders. My estimate is they can quote them about 20 times faster than anyone else in the industry can quote them. So this is a job where you might spend 100 hours quoting it, and we can turn that thing around in half a day. There is product to build, but you need to strike this balance between using ops to see enough of it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do see challenges to hit 100 orders by Q1 2025 for sure. But I don't think those are different challenges from any of the ones that we've been dealing with for all of our previous quarters. It's just knowing when to sequence when you do the engineering work. I do think one thing that's actually made like low key kind of making a huge difference. I mean, low key because it's very hyped, right? Everyone talks about AI and there are a lot of hypey parts of AI, but a lot of the problems in construction are of a particular type, which is, hey, I've got data in this like one format and I'm trying to get it into another format. And it's mostly just copy pasting, but there is enough of my good judgment that I need to apply that it's not just a copy paste job. So humans need to do it. And I actually think a lot of that work can just get handled by certain applications of AI. And we're being very thoughtful about how we take those approaches, but I think there's huge upside there. And so I would expect what this means is the project manager job of the future is way less data crunching and way more executive decision making and review. And that's a really exciting place to be, I think, if you're a project manager in construction.
Yeah, very good. Can we talk about funding and financing? So you're 3 years now, the company?
Yeah.
2021.
We launched in January 2022 and we worked on it for about 3 or 4 months before that.
So was this self-funded to start with, or?
Yes. Yeah. I bootstrapped a lot of it. My other co-founder Rodney put in a bit as well. We used his manufacturing facility as sort of a testing ground for the first little bit.
Where is the facility?
In the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, and then we grew out of that.
Yeah. And so when did you raise your first round?
We raised a pre-seed around the same time we went to Y Combinator. And then we raised our seed round out of the other side of Y Combinator.
Okay, cool. And who are your investors currently?
Well, we have a number of investors, right? A number of angels, scout funds. The sort of investors that I speak to a lot. One is Mark McCabe. He's been a great angel for us. He's ex-early Airbnb, so he's the guy I speak to a lot about marketplaces. Our main investor at Andreessen Horowitz is Jeff Jordan. Jeff is the marketplace guy. And we also took investments from Fundamental. Patrick at Fundamental, who you have on your podcast a lot, is the guy I speak to about any property or construction tech related stuff, AEC stuff. Just such an expert. And then Mike Chalfin in the UK of Chalfin Ventures, who has been just an awesome sounding board and is a lot more of a sort of marketplace and European kind of generalist.
Yeah. So you were, I guess, very strategic about who you wanted on your cap table.
Yeah, we thought about it a lot. Yeah.
Was there any like disappointment and rejection when you were fundraising, or was it quite?
Or you had it all figured out?
Yeah.
Well, those are two different things. There was a lot of rejection. I wasn't disappointed to get it.
Yeah.
You know, back in the day when we were just a team of 3 at Uber, we would put on suits and go down to the airport and speak to drivers and say, hey, we've built this thing that we think could really help you earn more revenue. And most drivers would basically just, shut the door in our face. So we used to call that collecting our nose, And so I got to brush off that playbook a little bit and just go, hey, listen, I'm going to get 100 no's before I get a yes. And so I actually think I approach fundraising a lot more militantly than maybe other founders do. It was, for me, a really aggressive speed dating game. And I must have spoken to 100 different potential investors to land at the ones that we liked. And that did generate a lot of interest for us, which was great. And I also learned a lot about who I don't want to go on this journey with, right? Hype investors will kill us because we are, even momentum investors at this stage, like we're making a category. We're building a thing that hasn't really been tried before in this industry. It's going to succeed or fail on the strength of our relationships with our customers and our suppliers, which means patience is very important, right? And it's a hard problem. Like, it's really complicated to quote custom stuff automatically and find the right person to do it and avoid mistakes in an industry where lots of stuff goes wrong. So that just means picking the right investors is one of the most important things I can do as a CEO.
What advice would you have for founders who are trying to raise some money for the startup and construction?
Oof.
Can be what to do or can be what not to do.
I think for sure there is potentially a lot of risk in trying to raise a lot of money and then spending that money. So one of the easiest ways to lose a lot of money is raise a lot of money because you get lazy, right? Like I think Patrick's a fan of saying constraint breeds art, right? And I think that's very true in construction because you don't know what's going to work and the cost of being wrong is quite high, right? You're building built things. So being very sure about how you're going to deploy your capital before you know what that number is, I think is the first thing. I think the second thing is one of the things that I notice, right, is like a lot of the software in my industry is built actually not really by people from the tech industry, right? It's built by self-trained engineers who used to work at a construction company and outside of like Autodesk, right, who really will deal with you through resellers unless you're spending millions of dollars a year with them. So the product loop is kind of broken a little bit. It's a lot of the industry software is built by like very, very small players trying to solve a very local solution, so it's not connected, right? And so one of the most interesting things you can do as a founder is like bring a talent pool from outside the industry into the industry, but then you need to be really thoughtful about how you graft into the industry knowledge as well. So I quite like the idea of cross-functional founding teams. Typically, I think it's totally fine for founders to be solo. I don't think you need a co-founder. I don't think it's any lonelier. I think it's got pros and cons. But in construction, I think it makes sense to have a founding team because the need for domain knowledge is so high. And if you're hiring from people who have built software in this industry before, you're actually not necessarily getting top tier talent. And so you can actually go to other places and pull that in.
Mm-hmm. On this first, I will call it principle. Don't try to raise so much money and then spend it quickly. How much did you raise?
We tend to keep these numbers a little quiet outside of fundraising rounds. Part of the reason for that is like I just don't think it's an important number to be public for our customers or manufacturers. And also I think founders celebrate this number way too much, right? It's the tool to get the job done.
It's the marker of success when you raise money.
Yeah, totally. But I will be honest and say we potentially raised too much money. We potentially underestimated how long it was going to take to crack this problem.
So that wasn't a question actually. The question was how do you want to like break this money down into months or quarters or years? Like, do you have a plan for a year? Is it like for a year or 2 years or maybe a quarter?
No.
How are you thinking about it?
I think once you raise VC money, you have to show growth, right? There's plenty of ways to show growth that aren't revenue. So revenue targets are not always the most helpful way to think about it. I always tell the team, we're not being paid to hit revenue targets necessarily. We're being paid to build the machine. And so proof that the machine is working is more important. And that can be different types of things. It can be key accounts closed. It can be customers coming back and spending more money with you in time. Depending on your business, there's different types of numbers to hit. For us, we look very deeply at customer retention. So every single time a job goes wrong, I review a post-mortem write-up of why that job went wrong, how it went wrong. Do we understand what the fix could be? Is the fix already in place or does it need to be bracketed? Do we need to organize a team around getting that thing fixed? Because I think quality, it's not necessarily the most important thing on every job, but if you don't have it, you don't get jobs. So you have to be good enough on that. So when we think about business success for us, it's customers coming back, spending more with us in time, and really as little as possible going wrong in order to service those customers. And to the extent that we can prove that, I think the revenue numbers will fall where they may. But I think in that scenario, an investor is going to be very excited.
So at this stage, when you're showing the growth and you're showing the growth, at what point do you start looking at the revenues?
Well, I think when you say revenue, you're probably talking about what we would call contribution margin, right? So our stack looks a little different. We have turnover, then we have revenue, which is our take rate, and then we have contribution margin, which is if you if you cover all the operational costs, how much goes to the fixed costs, right? So we look a lot at that. And the annoying thing about speaking to marketplace founders is they always give you an "it depends" answer, right? You always want to say what's more important, profit or growth, and the answer is both. And so we think about this in terms of ranges. That contribution to bottom line number cannot be negative, and ideally we're clearing at least 20% of the gross revenue that we take in goes to the bottom line. And if we're in that environment, then we can be quite aggressive on, discounts or price experimentation or dropping margins or different things like that. But we kind of keep within that rail. So we shouldn't be growing if we're outside of those rails. We should be trying to fix what's wrong with the fundamentals before we grow. And if we're in those rails, then we should be growing as fast as we can.
He sounds like he knows it well.
Yeah. I won't question that. How long? We've got probably roughly 10 minutes or so left to go. So, Martin, is there something burning you want to cover?
Do we have a lot of marketplaces in construction? And why not?
There are a bunch.
Are we having more, or are they getting success?
I think less. I think there's less in construction than other industries for a couple of reasons. One, a lot of transactions in construction are B2B. It's not clear what a B2B marketplace looks like yet. Like, we're in the early days of that, and I think that's really exciting.
And each vertical has different kind of vibe and different constraints probably.
Yeah, you can approach some of those problems. Like, you can jump verticals with the right technology. So you can build solutions that figure that stuff out depending on specifically what we're talking about. But actually, I think one of the bigger issues is marketplaces work really well when the cost of learning is low. What I mean by that is, like, if something goes wrong, nobody dies, and the speed of learning is really high. So you see transactions quickly, and you can build good software to really make those transactions easier. So, Uber taxis, really fast transactions, really relatively low cost of being wrong. Worst thing that normally happens is someone misses a taxi. Airbnb, you turn up and potentially that you can't get into the house. That's like a much higher cost of being wrong, but still a great marketplace, right? And then you go into construction, and suddenly you're starting to talk about transactions in the thousands that take place over months, and that's almost a different type of business model again, right? And so I think there haven't just been that many B2B marketplaces, and so I think actually this is a timing question. I think the future is going to have lots more B2B marketplaces, and I'm very excited about that. I actually think it's a huge opportunity for construction. But to do that, we're going to have to build new types of technology, and we're going to have to adjust some of the marketplace best practices to how B2B and supply chain work, and that's going to take some time.
And that will happen without making things more standardized and kind of boring and annoying, that you can't have so many choices like you have now. You contact someone and you get these bespoke things done.
That may be like a separate vector to think about this stuff. I don't think that's a trade-off of working with a marketplace. I don't think bespoke is always a trade-off, right? There's plenty of marketplaces that do custom products, right? Fair is a great example of a B2B marketplace, came out of Y Combinator. They sell lots of different types of small provider stuff. They're like I guess you'd say maybe a B2B Etsy. Hopefully they're not angry at me. But I don't think the customization of the product is the trade-off necessarily. The customization of the customer might be the problem. So if you've got
the mood swings and
if you've got two customers that are general contractors, but in reality they do something slightly different, but that leads to very different product requirements, that might be a bigger hurdle to overcome in construction, because on the one hand, we're dealing with, there's probably a couple of 100,000 interior builders in Europe, right? And yet there are so many different subspecializations and sub-niches, even down to what machine do they have and what does that enable them to do, right? I can build a cabinet well on a CNC machine. I can build a cabinet poorly using my hands or slowly. And so am I in the same market offering the same product, or do I have to find a slightly different type of customer? And that's going to be some stuff that I think a lot of B2B marketplaces have to grapple with, especially in construction.
Okay. Talk to us briefly, perhaps, about the future of Cutr. I think you touched upon that, and I get the impression, maybe because of something you said, that timber won't be the only focus, and you may look to go into other markets as well, or other maybe materials.
Well, I think we'll have to grapple with other materials because of the nature of how products get made, right? Like if you're doing even a joinery package, there's some handles in there, there's appliances, so there's going to be stuff that we have to deal with there. But I think we're all a big part of the reason why I was able to convince some awesome founding engineers from really important technology companies to come and work on this problem, not to mention all the other great talent that we have, is because the mission really is make wood the world's fastest, cheapest, and easiest building material, and then just get more people to build more things out of wood. And so we're very, very kind of committed to like staying in the wood-based part of this problem to solve in construction. The good news is today, based on advances in all sorts of approaches to thinking about how you engineer timber, cross-laminate timber, all that sort of stuff, really the potential market share there is really anything in a city that's under 30 stories that isn't built out of wood that could be, right? So it's a very, very big material supply chain. I'm not sure we should be in a hurry to add more materials to the mix other than what's necessary to enable like building a mostly wood-based product. So that's what we're most excited about.
Very good.
I want to touch on the partnerships, building a marketplace.
Mm-hmm. And maybe go to market as well, because it will come under the same umbrella.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
But keep it relatively brief.
Yes, sir.
We've got a couple more questions.
How important are partnerships for you?
Yeah, hugely important. Hugely important. So we actually have a SaaS tool, and we give it to material dealers, right? And the reason we do that is because it's very hard to get accurate prices on materials unless you're working very closely with those dealerships. So we have to build partnerships in that direction, right? Our manufacturers have to negotiate a bunch of things in the effort to do their work. So, I have to buy hardware, I have to buy tools, I have to buy all sorts of stuff. And so there's lots of partnerships that we can build there that actually make our manufacturers' lives easier. And then partnerships with our manufacturers themselves, right? So one thing that may not be obvious is our customers are also our suppliers. So interior builders, if they're not busy enough, can take jobs on Cutr. If they're too busy, they can outsource jobs on Cutr. And whether they do that and how they choose to do that comes down to, how deeply do they understand Cutr? What's the experience they've had with it? Do both teams in that business, the sales team and the project management team, do they both like Cutr? So there's a lot of like going very, very deeply into partnerships with the customers that we have as well, or the suppliers that we have. So I think that answers your question. Very important. Yeah.
What about then? I suppose partnerships and go-to-market maybe overlap slightly.
It does, yeah.
Yeah, getting to your customers.
Yeah, I mean, our first go-to-market is speak to interior builders and say, hey, what's your biggest problem? And they'll either say, I'm not busy enough and I need more work, or I'm too busy and I can't quote everything that's coming in. And depending on whether they say one or the other, we say, well, we think we can solve that for you by being either a supplier or a customer. And then over time, as we start to understand the business, we do more jobs together, they actually start to change their workflow a lot as a result of working on Cutr as well. So either they're buying more machines, they're scaling up on particular types of jobs that they get on Cutr, or they're actually building an outsourcing motion when previously they've never been able to outsource because they haven't got the process in place or anything like that, or they're doubling the amount of revenue that they've been able to do in sort of a 12-month period, which is next to impossible for a factory to do, right? Because you have to invest more capex, but they can do it by expanding their ability to grow on Cutr. So that's really our first go-to-market is speak to interior builders, figure out what they want, and either work with them on the supply side or the demand side, and ultimately end up working with them on both sides.
Interesting. What's the strategy to get to these people? Are you mostly outbound or heavy in socials?
Yeah, we go to a lot of trade shows. We spend a lot of time on the road, right? I was just in Latvia. I was in sunny Corby earlier this week. and now in London as well, speaking to some others. So we're all on the road. Everybody on the team knows how to do the various jobs required to either speak to a supplier or speak to a customer. But we also spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, actually. Sort of running campaigns, speaking to people. We have a manufacturer directory. So we essentially, every time we meet a manufacturer, we sort of put them up on the directory. And then typically if any jobs come randomly through the directory to them, we'll forward them on even before they're on the marketplace. And so different ways like that. We essentially just try to add a little value and tell our story before we end up doing a first job together, because it can take a while to get to first job, right?
Yeah, especially in construction.
Mm-hmm.
In India, Inframarket started buying production facilities when they started doing very well with their marketplace. Like, do you see that potentially could similar dynamics would work with you?
I don't think so. I don't think we'll do that. Here's why. One, because the supply chain is so fragmented, it doesn't necessarily, you're not building a Tesla factory in the wood industry, right? Outside of cross-laminate timber factories that do high degrees of volume, or material manufacturers, most value-added manufacturers, like the ones who are building the sort of the housing components and different things like that, they're pretty small shops. So us buying a small shop and building out of there only gets us so far, actually. And it actually limits the amount of data we can get, right? We learn more about the factory, but we see less outside. I think the second piece is, I think about this in terms of where's the bulk of the innovation, right? If it's happening at a network level, then you need to build into the network. If it's happening in the factory because you're solving novel problems like building robots or something like that, then you should own the factory. And, when we're building cabinets and even doing a lot of different things in construction, most of those problems are solved problems. Actually, the novel problem to solve is, how do you get people to do things the right way when they're interacting with each other and they have different preferred processes? And so the innovation happens at the network level. I'd be open to buying like a experimental facility where we test things, like building direct to machine integrations and stuff like that. But I'd only be building that to make our manufacturers' lives easier. So if we could build a test loop to make sure that their factories are running smoother, that would probably be a condition. But other than that, I'm not particularly interested in it.
Brilliant.
One last question, then we'll wrap up. What's the day-to-day life of Oscar look like?
Well, this is the first podcast I've ever done since starting Cutr. So this is not normal day-to-day behavior. It's either collecting the shit that is rolled uphill. So, the stuff that the team can't de-escalate or handle themselves, or being on the road talking to the big customers or big manufacturers, or actually kind of diving into how to think about the product. I spend a little bit of time testing our own product as well. I spend a lot of time trying to find bugs, or just generally developing ideas on how our landing page should look with our growth team or different things like that. I try to spend as much time as possible speaking to customers and speaking to manufacturers. Every time I'm in a factory, I learn something new about how stuff gets put together, and I'm well aware that I'm from outside the industry, and so it's going to take another 3 years before I know as much as a manufacturer who's been in it. So that's where I spend a lot of my time. I don't spend a lot of time speaking to investors outside of fundraising cycles, but I do spend a lot of time speaking to our investors about how to prep for that.
Very nice. By the way, the website's super nice and clean.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I highly recommend people check that.
We've gone through a lot of bad websites to get to this one.
Yeah, it's super nice.
Yeah, that's great feedback.
Yeah, you're welcome. Cool. All right, Oscar. Well, thank you so much for joining us. I feel like we barely scratched the surface as we always.
A lot, actually.
Yeah, get to these end of these interviews. But could you just tell our audience where they can find out more about you and Cutr?
Sure. You can go to cutr.com. If you've got an idea for a project, you can sign up and throw up a CAD file and experience Cutr and speak to our team. If you've got any questions for me or anything like that, you can just hello@Cutr. I think that's the email, and I'll get back to you.
Just give your personal email out.
Yeah.
Much better.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Oscar.
Thank you.